Welcome back to Spirit Spells and Magic. In this episode, we are looking at a Book of Shadows for beginners. What is a Book of Shadows, and why do I need one? Well, you don't really need one, but we find if you're looking into Wiccan ways or pagan ways, it's good to have a Book of Shadows or simply a sketchbook or a notepad, anything that will help you learn the ways of the traditions and the Wheel of the Year and the various Sabbats. It is a way for us to put down what we learn into a book for later. And often we find a lot of information that we learn along the way isn't just from one book or one source. It could be from many different books and many different sources, like the internet, word of mouth, and books. And it's often hard for us to recall where we found some information if we need to find it later. So it's a good idea to have some form of book or notepad or sketchbook that you can put down these details that you find as you learn, so as that you don't have to run back and try and look in maybe 10 different books for the information you need, or try and find that website if you haven't saved the link. It's very good to have a book that you can go to that has all the information that you've learned so far, and also have a place that you can draw and make it personalised. A lot of people with their books of shadows glue plants in and other pages, stencils, stickers, anything that they wish to put in to personalise their book. Now, what type of book do you need for a book of shadows? Well, you can use anything you like, from a notepad with lines and just jot down everything that you learn, to having an elaborate picture book that you make yourself with illustrations of your choice or cutouts and lots of different colours and plants and herbs and things stuck inside. People go all out with their Book of Shadows, and you can too, or you can have it as simple as you need. Another tip for a Book of Shadows, if you're going to have something that's quite elaborate and pretty and full of colour and imagination, is to have a backup book. A backup book or scrapbook that you can first put down your ideas for your Book of Shadows, because like myself, I am by no means an artist and it takes me a while to perfect something. So if I'm going to write some information down in my newly created book, I definitely want to get it right the first time. So I have a scrapbook that I use to jot my information down in first and sort it out so as I know what it's going to look like when I put it in my Book of Shadows. It's kind of like a rough draft of what your masterpiece is going to look like. And often, if you're like me and don't have the neatest handwriting ever, it's good just to have somewhere that you can quickly jot that information down from whatever source you're finding it. And like me too, if you like learning things and you're excitable when you first find out information, I scribble stuff down and sometimes it's not in order and things like that. So it's good to have somewhere just to put it down first and then organise it so as that later you can put it into your Book of Shadows nice and neat and beautiful. You can use anything to make your Book of Shadows. I'm doing mine by hand, and I'm creating it out of an A3 visual arts book. I'm going to try and use every part of it. First, I remove the binding because we're not going to be able to use that. And I put aside the front cover and the back cover for later. I watched a tutorial on bookbinding and thought I'd give it a go myself and document it as a beginner for other beginners. I've broken it into 2 parts because it's quite in depth. The first step was tea staining some of the pages that we have. I didn't stain all of them in case I need to colour some in later on. I used a variety of teas, including the Twinings Cold Water Infusion, as well as some English breakfast and some Nevada tea, just anything I had laying around really. Enlisting the help of my daughter to do the tea staining, we took each page and did a line down to cover the white space. Now with tea staining, it is quite time consuming, so make sure you block out a bit of time to do this. And this is also why I didn't do every single one of the sheets, because it did take a long time to get done. Now the key was not to press down too hard, because after a few pages the tea bags start to deteriorate and burst, and then you end up with bits of tea everywhere. So it was best to keep them wet as well, and that kept a strong colour of the tea. Once we were finished on one side, we hung them up with pegs on a clothesline, and then we waited for them to dry, and then completed the same step again on the other side. It was quite fun. It was time consuming, but it was fun. They didn't take too long to dry either, even though it wasn't particularly sunny. But there was a little bit of wind which helped, and keeping the pages separated by the pegs and the line helped them in drying quicker. I'd probably block out a couple of hours for this process, for them to dry and then to do the other side. But once they were complete, they were ready for stitching and cutting off the edges where the holes were, as we don't need to have them with holes in the book. We're not using a binder. So I trimmed off, or used scissors to trim off the edges. If you have a little guillotine, that's always helpful to have, but using whatever you have around the house to do this is quite all right. As long as you've got some scissors to cut off those edges, it's good. Now we did need to cut off the edge where the holes were, as we weren't using that for a binder anymore. So we trimmed those down, and you have to do it for every page. You can try and do it with a couple of pages at once, as long as you keep maybe a peg around the end, just so it doesn't end cutting too much off the paper. And you want them to be relatively even too. I mean, it is your book, and you're making it by hand if you choose to do so. So if it has a couple of little imperfections, that's quite all right. Now we did that for the rest of the paper that wasn't tea stained. I was going to mix in a bit of tea stained paper with non-tea stained paper, so as that it gave a little bit of contrast, and I might want to colour it in later on with watercolours or stick pictures on or something like that, so they didn't need to all be tea stained. Now, the process of bundling these papers, I ended up with 40 sheets of A3 after my daughter took a couple for herself. And I've put a couple aside for another little trick later on. But what we do is I had 40 sheets, and I broke them down into 5 sheets so they wouldn't be too thick, so as that I could stitch them in properly. And that left me with 8 bundles or 8 signatures to stitch in. You can use a bone folder if you have one to fold the papers nice and tightly so as that they're not going to open up. If you don't have a bone folder, using the back of a knife or the back of a butter knife, as well as a spoon, is fine, just to give it a good crisp fold. And you do that for all the bundles that you have. You continue this till you've finished all of those bundles, pop them into little lots, ensuring that they're all even and they're all the same size. But it is quite a peaceful process of doing this. I sped it up a little bit too, because it does take a little time to watch. But once you've done them all, a good idea is to get the cover ready as well. Now I'm using the back of the A3 book as the front and back cover of my Book of Shadows. Now I do need a spine piece, so I found a box, an old dishwashing tablet box, and I trimmed out the binding holes off the back piece and cut that directly in half so they're both even on both sides. With the dishwashing box, I cut out a part for the spine of the cover. This is so that you can open and shut the book without it being too tight and giving it a bit extra room for all of those signatures or the binding pages to fit in. Now, unfortunately, I found a box that was too thin, so I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll cut out 2 pieces of the spine and glue them together to make it extra thick. It's handy to have pieces of cardboard lying around. You never know when they'll come in handy. Once I trimmed out the pieces of the spine, made sure that they were completely even, because they're going to be hot glue gunned together. Now ensure that if you're going to be using the hot glue gun, you get it warm pretty quickly and you're ready to go. Because once that glue starts coming out, you've got to use it, otherwise it's just going to ooze out everywhere. And make sure, what I didn't do both sides. It just makes it better if you do both sides. If you're going to glue something together, don't just do one side and hope it's enough, because it wasn't. And it started drying quicker than I could get the pieces together. So if that does happen, just go around the edges and make sure that you cover any part that's still kind of bobbing open. And I also trimmed it down a little bit more too. Now, to put these pieces together and have a joint that you can open and close, I use a piece of book contact. And it doesn't matter that it's got pandas all over, because we're going to colour it in later. But this is just to stick the 2 pieces of the front and the back cover with the spine, so as that there is a little space between so that they can easily open and close. Now, cutting a strip of these, one to go at the back and one to go at the front of the joint, just to make sure that it's very secure. Now, once again, it's going to be painted over, so it doesn't matter too much that it's got pandas all over it, but a clear contact would be good. And there's also other types of adhesive that you can buy from Spotlight and such that do the same job, but like me, if you've got equipment lying around that you can use, why not? Better not to go and have to purchase everything if you've got stuff at home to use. Once you've done one joint, you go ahead and you do the other side, attaching the back or the front as well. Now, it's very good that you take your time to do this. Make sure it's as even as possible. And then it opens and closes very easily. There we go. Now we've got our cover put together, we can continue with doing our signatures. Thread a needle of good quality and some good quality thread, and go ahead and measure each one of your little bundles where you're going to be sewing it through. It's good to have a peg or paper clip or some kind of clip to hold the pages tightly together so as that it's all even. And use some kind of a punch or needle to go through and pop a hole through those pages so as that when it's time to thread through, the holes are already there. It makes life a lot easier. Now, for the paper fabric, I used an old piece of canvas that we weren't using anymore, and this will be where your paper is sewn into the book. We sew it into the canvas so it keeps all of the signatures or bundles tightly together, and then later on we'll hot glue gun that piece of canvas with all the paper stuck attached or stitched into it. We'll hot glue gun that into the spine. So it's best to have the canvas the same size as the spine of the book. Make sure you measure out everything before you go cutting. And then on the canvas, it's a good idea to measure out where each of the signatures or where each bundle of paper is going to be stitched in. And go ahead and mark the holes mark on the canvas where the holes are going to be going through. So later on when you're doing the stitching, it's quite easy to find where a bundle of pages have to go, so as that you don't stitch it in the wrong spot or they're too close together or too far apart. It's best to do all of this making the pattern first, so as that later on when you start stitching it's a lot easier to follow, as it is a time-consuming process as well. Now we start by putting the thread on the needle and then putting the needle through the middle hole of the page and down into the canvas. When you're pulling the string through, make sure to leave a couple of inches before in the center of the page, because this is where you're going to come back to and tie it in a knot later on. So make sure you leave a couple of inches in the center of the book of the string, and then go down through the canvas to the other side. And then what you want to do is come back through one of the other holes, either the top or the bottom hole, and back to the middle of the book again, making sure you go through that canvas each stitch. Now we pop it back through into the center, and then we're going to go down into the hole that you haven't used. So if you've come up through the bottom, you'll be going back down through the top. Or if you've come through the top, you'll be going back down through the bottom, to make sure that each hole gets the stitch through. And the canvas at the back, it is very important that the stitch goes through the back of the canvas. Take your time to do it, because it is quite a process, especially if you're, like myself, not entirely great at stitching and sewing and things like that. Just take your time. It's a simple step, but it does need to be done carefully, because if you miss a stitch somewhere or you don't go through the canvas, it can cause real problems later on. And I came across a couple of problems, and as we go along I'll show you. Now once you've gone through that last hole to the back, we've got to come back in through the middle hole, where that little bit of thread you left in the beginning should still be waiting for you. And once we go back in through the middle and out through the other side, then we can take the needle off the thread, and what we'll do is we'll tie a knot using the thread you just took the needle off, as well as the thread that was left in the beginning, and you will tie a knot with those two threads. Now this being the first one that you're stitching through, it's best to make sure that you get it right the first time. And make that stitch, the knot tight, and the stitch as tight as you can to the canvas, so as it's not loose and hanging free. We want them to be as snug to that canvas as possible. And it's an idea to do 2 knots to make sure that they're both secure. And that's your first signature. Now if you don't like the look of it, pull the string out and do it again. There's plenty of time. As you do each one, if you're not happy with the way you've stitched it in, take it out, do it again. It's better to do each one tightly and as neatly as possible, rather than finish all of them and find that one in the centre is a bit loose and then you've got to pull it apart and trying to do it while you've got a whole heap of others already stitched in. It makes it a bit difficult. So just make sure as you're doing each one that you're happy that it's tightly in there and it's snug. And then move on to the next one. Measure up the holes, punch the holes through, and we begin the stitching process again. Now, it doesn't have to be perfect. If it's just for you and you're not making them to sell, and if you're a beginner, that's quite ambitious. But if you're just making it for yourself, take your time, do it as best you can. I mean, this is a first attempt for me, and it's most likely the first attempt if you're watching this as a beginner's tutorial. So take your time, make sure that the stitches aren't loose, that they're as tight as they can be, and repeat the steps one after the other. It was probably ambitious to do 8 of them. Maybe you can start with 4 or 5 little bundles to stitch in. In hindsight, I would have done something like that. And make sure you haven't got too many pages in each bundle. Otherwise, you'll find that it's really hard to keep them all together and hard to get them stitched in properly. It is a process. The more you try it, the faster you get at it. But don't get cocky like I did, because I found that there was a couple of errors I made. The little string at the beginning popped through and I had to redo it again. But I found that putting a peg on the end of the string helps so it doesn't go through. I mean, you can put a knot in the end like normal sewing. You'd put a knot in the end so the end doesn't pass through the fabric. But if you're going to be using it at the end to tie 2 knots, make sure that you leave yourself those couple of inches. I found just putting a peg on the end helped it from going through. And you'll see here. But this is how we do it. Trial and error. A lot of the tutorials I find are done by people who have done it many, many, many times. So the tutorials are, I guess, on the onus that you've done it before, or if it is a beginner's tutorial, I find that they go really fast and you can't keep up with how they did it. So apologies if I have gone too fast. I've tried to keep it as slow as possible, but not too slow so as it's not as repetitive, and you can clearly see some parts of how I've done it, so I didn't want to go over that too much. But I'd like to do this again, definitely. Once I finish this book, I'll have another go at it and see if I can improve. But it is quite a process in stitching in, but it's not impossible. And I'm proving that it's not impossible. It may not be perfect, but it's not impossible. Another problem I had was that the knot that I'd created at the end of one of the signatures actually pulled through the hole and to the canvas. So instead of securing the page to the canvas by knotting it, the knot actually went through the hole because the hole was quite large. So when you're punching the holes, make sure not to create too large a hole that the final knot doesn't go through the page. If that does happen, what I found was I did another stitch. So I got some separate thread and did another stitch through the center only, through the canvas, and then back up through the page again in a different spot so as that it wouldn't pass through that knot again. Just take your time and eventually you'll get them all sewn in. Just remember those little tips that I'm telling you. Having a peg to hold the end of it is really important. But if you take your time and you follow the steps, then that should turn out really well. We just repeat that for all of the bundles. Now there was a couple of times you'll probably notice the light changes. I've had to use a different camera and enlist help to film me while I did the last part of this when we had a camera error. But this shouldn't take longer than maybe an hour to stitch. I would have taken me about an hour to stitch all 8 in. But once you've stitched them all in, just have a little look at each one individually just to make sure that they're all snug and nice and tightly stitched in so that they don't fall apart later. You definitely don't want to go to all the trouble of getting your book put together only to find that one of the signatures falls out while you're trying to use your book of shadows. Definitely do not want that. And if that does happen, I'm sure there's a way that you can gently sew it back in. You may just have to take the cover off somehow. But the idea is to get it right the first time so you don't have any problems later on. But once you've stitched in the last one, you've pretty much got the signatures complete. And then the next step we'll do in the next part is hot glue gunning the signatures into the cover. But stay tuned, I'll have it up as soon as possible. And don't forget to like, subscribe and share if you enjoy this video, for many more to come. And have a wonderful day. Namaste.